The autumn wind howled through the ancient oak trees surrounding St. Catherine's Convent in Millbrook, Massachusetts, as Sister Margaret O'Brien made her way down the dimly lit corridor. It was October 15, 1983, and the 34-year-old Irish-American nun had been awake for hours, poring over financial documents that made her stomach turn with each passing page. For 8 years, Sister Margaret had dedicated her life to the children at St. Catherine's Orphanage, but recently, something had been deeply troubling her. The numbers didn't add up. Donations meant for the children's food, clothing, and medical care seemed to be disappearing into thin air. What should have been $50,000 in quarterly funding had dwindled to barely $20,000 reaching the actual programs. "Sister Margaret, you look troubled," said Sister Catherine, an elderly nun who had been at the convent for over 3 decades. Her wrinkled hands clutched a worn rosary as she observed the younger woman's distressed expression. "I need to speak with Brother Hartwell tomorrow," Sister Margaret replied, her Irish accent still faintly coloring her words despite years in America. "The children are suffering, and I think I know why." Brother Thomas Hartwell had been the convent's financial administrator for 5 years. A charming man in his 40s with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile, he had won over the Mother Superior and the bishop with his promises to modernize the convent's operations. But Sister Margaret had noticed discrepancies that couldn't be explained away by his smooth talking. That evening, as rain began to pelt the Gothic windows of the century-old building, Sister Margaret sat in her small room, writing in her journal by lamplight. She documented every suspicious transaction, every missing receipt, every excuse Brother Hartwell had given when questioned about the finances. Her handwriting was neat and precise, befitting a woman who had once been a schoolteacher before taking her vows. The storm outside grew more violent as the night progressed. Lightning illuminated the stone walls of the convent, casting eerie shadows that danced across the religious paintings hanging in the hallways. Sister Margaret had planned to confront Brother Hartwell first thing in the morning, but fate had other plans. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Sister Catherine later told investigators she saw Sister Margaret walking toward the administrative wing of the building. She said she couldn't sleep and wanted to organize her thoughts before tomorrow's meeting. Sister Catherine recalled, "She looked determined, but also frightened." That was the last time anyone saw Sister Margaret O'Brien alive. When morning came and Sister Margaret failed to appear for morning prayers, the other nuns initially assumed she was ill, but when they knocked on her door and found her room empty with her bed unslept in, panic began to set in. Her personal belongings were all there, her rosary, her Bible, even her shoes were neatly placed by her bed. But Sister Margaret herself had vanished without a trace. Detective Frank Morrison had seen his share of missing persons cases during his 15 years with the Massachusetts State Police. But there was something particularly unsettling about the disappearance of Sister Margaret O'Brien. The 45-year-old detective arrived at St. Catherine's Convent on the gray morning of October 16, 1983, to find a community in shock. "She was the most reliable person here," Mother Superior Agnes told Detective Morrison, her weathered hands trembling as she spoke. "Sister Margaret never missed morning prayers, never left without telling someone where she was going. This isn't like her at all." Detective Morrison began his investigation methodically, interviewing each of the 12 nuns who lived at the convent, as well as the handful of lay workers and volunteers. The picture that emerged was of a dedicated, quiet woman who had devoted her life to caring for the orphan children who lived at St. Catherine's. "She was like a mother to those kids," said Mrs. Helen Walsh, the convent's cook for over 20 years. "Always making sure they had enough to eat, always checking if they needed new clothes or books for school. The children adored her." But when Detective Morrison spoke with Brother Thomas Hartwell, he sensed something different. The man was polished, almost too cooperative, offering theories about Sister Margaret's disappearance that seemed rehearsed. "I'm worried she might have been struggling with her faith," Brother Hartwell suggested, his voice carrying just the right amount of concern. "She'd been asking a lot of questions about the convent's operations lately, seemed unsettled. Perhaps she decided to leave religious life, but didn't know how to tell the others." Detective Morrison found this suggestion troubling. Every other person he'd interviewed described Sister Margaret as deeply devoted to her calling. Why would Brother Hartwell paint such a different picture? The search efforts were extensive. Local police, state troopers, and volunteers combed through the 200-acre property surrounding the convent. They searched every building, every basement, every storage room. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Sister Margaret's scent, but the trail went cold just outside the administrative building. The storm from the night of her disappearance had washed away any potential footprints or other physical evidence. Detective Morrison found this timing suspicious. Why had Sister Margaret chosen such a terrible night to venture out, if that's indeed what had happened? For 3 weeks, the investigation continued. Detective Morrison discovered that Sister Margaret had been asking questions about the convent's finances, but Brother Hartwell dismissed this as a nun overstepping her boundaries. He provided financial records that appeared to be in order, though Detective Morrison noticed they were suspiciously recent copies, not the originals. She was becoming paranoid about money matters, Brother Hartwell explained during one interview. I think the stress of working with so many needy children was affecting her mental state. I tried to help her, but she became increasingly agitated with me. Despite Detective Morrison's growing suspicions about Brother Hartwell's story, he had no physical evidence, no witnesses to any crime, and no body. The case grew cold, filed away as a missing person presumed dead. Sister Margaret O'Brien became another unsolved mystery, her disappearance leaving a void in the hearts of those who knew her and a dozen orphan children wondering why their beloved caretaker had abandoned them. Brother Hartwell remained at the convent for another 2 years before requesting a transfer to a parish in Arizona, citing his grief over Sister Margaret's disappearance and his need for a fresh start. 20 years had passed since Sister Margaret's disappearance when Father Michael McKenna arrived at St. Catherine's Convent in the spring of 2003. At 38 years old, the energetic priest had been tasked by the diocese with revitalizing the aging facility and expanding its outreach programs. The convent had seen better days. Paint was peeling, the roof leaked in several places, and the grounds had grown wild with neglect. This place has so much potential, Father McKenna told Mother Superior Agnes, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever. With some renovations and proper landscaping, we can make St. Catherine's a beacon of hope in this community again. The diocese had approved a substantial renovation budget, and Father McKenna threw himself into the project with characteristic enthusiasm. He hired local contractors, consulted with architects, and developed plans to restore the convent to its former glory while adding modern amenities. Among the planned improvements was a complete overhaul of the grounds. The gardens that had once been Sister Margaret's pride and joy had become overgrown with weeds and wild shrubs. Father McKenna envisioned beautiful flower beds, vegetable gardens where the children could learn to grow their own food, and peaceful walking paths for prayer and reflection. Sister Margaret would have loved to see this, Mother Superior Agnes commented wistfully as she watched Father McKenna sketch out his plans for the garden renovation. She always said the children needed more outdoor space to play and learn. As autumn approached, the major construction work was nearly complete. The final phase involved landscaping the grounds, particularly the area behind the administrative building, where Father McKenna planned to install a memorial garden dedicated to the convent's history and the people who had served there over the decades. On October 12, 2003, just 3 days before the 20th anniversary of Sister Margaret's disappearance, the excavation crew arrived with heavy machinery to begin preparing the ground for the memorial garden. The area had been untouched for decades, covered with thick vegetation and old trees that blocked most of the sunlight. Jake Sullivan, the foreman for Sullivan Landscaping, had been working on church and convent properties for 15 years. He was known for his careful attention to detail and his respect for the sacred nature of the places where he worked. As his crew fired up the excavators to begin clearing the land, Jake noticed that Mother Superior Agnes was watching from her window, a look of profound sadness on her aged face. "Take it slow through here," Jake instructed his operator Tommy. "Chen, this is hallowed ground. We need to be respectful." As the excavator's bucket bit into the earth behind the administrative building, Tommy immediately noticed something unusual. The soil composition seemed different here, less compact, as if it had been disturbed before. Years of experience had taught him to recognize these subtle differences in the earth. "Jake, you might want to look at this," Tommy called out, shutting off the machine's engine. The sudden silence that fell over the construction site seemed almost supernatural. Birds stopped singing, and even the wind appeared to hold its breath as Jake approached the partially excavated area. What they were about to discover would shake the foundations of everything the St. Catherine's community believed about that terrible night 20 years ago. Father McKenna was reviewing architectural plans in his office when Jake Sullivan knocked urgently on his door. The landscaper's face was pale, his usual steady demeanor replaced by visible shaken concern. "Father, you need to come outside immediately," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've found something." As Father McKenna followed Jake toward the excavation site, he noticed that the construction crew had stopped working entirely. Tommy Chen stood beside his excavator, staring down into a partially dug area behind the administrative building. The other workers had gathered in a respectful circle, their heads bowed as if in prayer. "We found bones, Father," Jake explained, as they approached. "Human bones, and there's something else." Father McKenna's heart pounded as he looked down into the shallow grave that had been hidden beneath decades of overgrown vegetation. The skeletal remains were clearly visible, but what made his breath catch was the tarnished silver object lying beside them, a distinctive crucifix that he recognized from photographs in the convent's archives. "Dear God," Father McKenna whispered, making the sign of the cross. "Sister Margaret?" Within hours, the site was swarming with investigators. Detective Sarah Chen, Tommy's cousin and now a senior detective with the state police, had been called in to oversee what was clearly now a murder investigation. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of an adult female, approximately 30-35 years old, and that she had been buried there for roughly 20 years. But the most shocking discovery came when the crime scene technicians carefully excavated around the remains. Wrapped in deteriorated plastic and buried alongside Sister Margaret's body was a manila envelope containing photocopied financial documents, evidence of the embezzlement that had cost Sister Margaret her life. She must have hidden copies of these documents before confronting her killer, Detective Chen explained to Father McKenna. She knew she was in danger. The documents painted a clear picture of systematic theft that had been going on for years. Brother Thomas Hartwell had been siphoning money from donations intended for the orphanage, falsifying records, and using his position of trust to line his own pockets. The amounts were staggering. Over $200,000 had been stolen from funds meant to feed, clothe, and educate vulnerable children. Sister Margaret discovered the truth, Detective Chen continued, and someone killed her to keep her quiet. Detective Frank Morrison, now retired but called back to consult on the case, felt a mixture of vindication and regret as he reviewed the evidence. "I always suspected Brother Hartwell," he admitted. "But he was smart, charming, and he had destroyed most of the financial records. Without Sister Margaret's hidden documentation, we never could have proven anything." The search for Brother Thomas Hartwell began immediately. Now 68 years old, he had spent the past 18 years as a parish administrator in Phoenix, Arizona, where, according to a quick audit, similar financial irregularities had occurred. The FBI arrested him at his comfortable home in Scottsdale, where he had been living well beyond what his modest church salary should have afforded. During interrogation, faced with overwhelming evidence, Hartwell finally confessed. The story he told was both tragic and infuriating. "She was going to ruin everything," he said, showing no remorse. "I had worked too hard to build my life to let some naive nun destroy it all." She came to my office that night during the storm, demanding to see the original financial records. She said she was going to call the police and the bishop in the morning. Hartwell described how he had argued with Sister Margaret, trying to convince her that the missing money had been used for legitimate expenses she didn't understand. When she refused to back down and threatened to expose him, He had struck her in anger. The blow killed her instantly. Panicking, Hartwell had wrapped her body and, using the cover of the severe storm, buried her in the garden behind the administrative building. He then spent the rest of the night destroying evidence and preparing his story about Sister Margaret's supposed mental instability and voluntary disappearance. The confession brought closure to a mystery that had haunted the St. Catherine's community for 2 decades, but it also brought profound sadness. Sister Margaret had died trying to protect the children she loved, and those same children had spent 20 years believing she had abandoned them. Father McKenna organized a proper funeral for Sister Margaret, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Many of the orphans she had cared for, now adults with families of their own, came to pay their respects to the woman who had been like a mother to them. "She never left us," said David Martinez, who had been 8 years old when Sister Margaret disappeared. "She was protecting us even in death." The memorial garden where Sister Margaret's body had been found was redesigned as a place of honor in her memory. A beautiful statue of St. Margaret of Scotland, Sister Margaret's patron saint, was erected at the center, surrounded by flowers that bloom year-round. A plaque reads, "In memory of Sister Margaret O'Brien, who gave her life protecting those who could not protect themselves." Brother Thomas Hartwell was sentenced to life in prison for murder and multiple counts of embezzlement. The money he had stolen was never recovered. He had spent it on gambling, luxury vacations, and maintaining an expensive lifestyle that was completely contrary to his religious vows. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the scholarship fund established in Sister Margaret's name, funded by donations from around the world after her story became widely known. The fund ensures that children like those she had protected would always have access to education, health care, and the love they deserved. As Father McKenna stood in the memorial garden 1 year after Sister Margaret's body had been discovered, watching children from the local community play among the flowers that bloomed where she had been buried, he reflected on the power of truth and the enduring nature of love. Sister Margaret O'Brien had not died in vain. Her courage had eventually brought justice, and her memory continued to protect and nurture children long after her death. The mystery that had begun with a disappearance in 1983 had finally been solved, bringing peace to a community that had never stopped wondering what had happened to their beloved Sister Margaret. Her legacy lived on, not in the manner of her death, but in the lives she had touched and the children she had died trying to protect.